Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andra Gillespie. I am the director of the James Weldon Johnson Institute. And on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of JWJI, I'd like to welcome you to today's Race and Difference Colloquium session. Today, we are pleased to have Dr. Elizabeth Gillespie McRae. Her scholarly interests center on race, politics, and education in the post-war United States. She's the Creighton Sossaman Professor of History at Western Carolina University, where she also co-directs the Appalachian Oral History Project. Her book, Mothers of Massive Resistance, White Women and the Politics of White Supremacy, was published in 2018 and received the Frederick Jackson Turner Award given by the Organization of American Historians and the Frank and Harriet Owsley Award given by the Southern Historical Association and the Society for Professors of Education Outstanding Book Award. This book examines white women's work in maintaining white supremacy in public education, social welfare policy, politics, and culture in the South and nation. Her work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, World Histories, Public Schools First, and various radio shows and podcasts. She's also worked with the National Council on School Diversity. Her current project examines the role of school choice in American public education. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth McRae.
I'd like to thank the director, Professor Andra Gillespie, and Antoinette Murrell, and Rhonda Patrick, and the James Weldon Johnson Institute for inviting me today. I also appreciate the attendance and participation of the James Weldon Johnson Institute fellows, Dr. Francine Allen Adams, Dr. Barbara Combs, and Haley Harrell, who's a pre-doctoral fellow, almost a doctoral fellow. So I'm really honored to be here because literally I could not have done this work without the scholars and scholarship done at Emory University. Professors Anderson, Dudziak, Crispino, Ward, former Emory faculty Brett Gadsden, Natasha Trethaway, the work of Vanessa Seidel-Walker. I'm really honored to be here and really indebted to the work that comes out of the larger sort of Emory University. Today in the United States, it seems in Congress that less than a decade ago, some Americans were evoking a post-racial society. It would seem nearly impossible to ignore that white supremacy has emerged undeniably as a visible political strategy. It was impossible, mind you, for many to ignore even in the post-racial moment. But the litany of events, like the litany of Black citizens killed by police violence, is long, culminating most recently in the insurrection on January 6th at the Capitol, or more quietly with the 1776 report released on Dr. Martin Luther King's holiday. Paralleling this violence and interwoven with it is the war waged on voting rights, clearly in Georgia under the governance of Brian Kemp, in my home state of North Carolina, where in 2018, the circuit court had declared that North Carolina's restrictions on voting rights were, quote, targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision, and in fact imposed cures for problems that did not exist. And currently we're somewhere north of 43 states in the United States discussing and state legislatures debating limits on voting. So if the overt nature of today's racist politics is a departure, and I'm not sure it is, the actors who take center stage seem more familiar. Let me see if I can. Young and old, angry white men dressed in jackboots and flannel, draped in Confederate flags and swastikas, tossing around racist epithets, guns, violence, threats, murder, and men. That is the familiar of white supremacist politics. But for the past 20 years, I've had questions about their centrality in the persistence of white supremacist politics. Is white supremacist politics and the systems it creates really the work of the disaffected? If we could ban them from public life, would white supremacist politics wither on the vine? I think, right, that the answer is no, that we must turn to the less familiar, to white women who did generational work to reinvigorate and reshape and shift white supremacist politics throughout much of the 20th century and into the 21st. We have arrived at this moment in part because of white segregationist women's sophisticated and sustained efforts to secure racial segregation. They used, as Professor Gillespie said in her introduction, the social welfare bureaucracy, the public schools, partisan politics, and culture talk to ensure that legal and customary segregation, written in law and performed in the daily interactions, would mold society. It was white women who staged a relentless, continual march of grassroots work, everyday, mundane work in local communities to sustain and build a system of white over black. They built networks among female conservatives. They coordinated with national organizations. They affected local, state, and national elections. They worked in PTA meetings and historic societies. They wrote columns in newspapers and conducted extensive correspondence with women across the United States. Their work confronted a vision of white women as guardians of domestic life, and that domestic life encompassed homes and children and schools and elections and campaigns. They shaped how their communities, their neighbors, their friends, and their children understood white motherhood, history, current and international events, public schools, sex and marriage, Black resistance, and their families. They may not have been the most visible faces of public faces of the Jim Crow order, although they're pretty visible in this slide, but they were segregation's constant gardeners. And I'll sort of come back to this at the conclusion, but I think it's helpful to think about the work they did as sort of this broader educational work and who was trained to do it, who this work targeted, how this work was consumed, right, in creating this larger kind of investment in a Jim Crow citizenship. So rather than seeing the white supremacist politics of today as sporadic or episodic, or even, and perhaps recently the most seductive sort of role, as cultivated by a national leader, I think it's worth going to the ground and looking at how it's shaped in local communities by local people, sort of a hometown version of Ibram X. Kendi's producers of racist ideologies, white segregationist women. So white women knew that racial inequality required law and custom, legal challenges and etiquette, institutional practice and bedtime readings. It required an interplay between, and here I'm borrowing from Professor Combs' work, the macro and the micro. And so that interplay that she talks about is critically important for these white segregationist women. They knew that to keep it central in American society, that segregation required a near constant adaptation and experimentation with different political discourses, including but not limited to colorblindness. For segregation to live required a revision of the past and an eye to the future, a fluidity and exchange of narratives. And I think here probably Professor Alan Adams could offer even greater insight. This sort of public narrative required constant editing and constant cultivation. So with this framework in mind, I'm going to give a few examples from the interwar period. So from after women's suffrage in 1920 until roughly the end of World War II. And then we'll go to sort of 3 examples from what I think we're more familiar with in thinking about the traditional civil rights movement. So the late 40s, 50s, 60s, and into anti-busing. In 1924, Virginia's legislature passed at that time the most restrictive racial integrity law in the nation. It reified the one-drop rule, it erased Native American identity, and it left citizens with the choice of Black or white, which had not been the case in earlier US censuses. It ostensibly was passed to eliminate passing, right, for folks with, as the legislatures put it, Black sort of heritage, passing as white in this sort of Jim Crow world. To work, however, the law relied on the familiar: midwives, registrars, social workers, and school teachers to ferret out racial identity. As the progressive era transformed them into workers for the state, they had to gaze in the most intimate spaces of family life, shoring up whiteness by policing genealogies and bedrooms and births, intruding and cataloging and controlling behaviors at the most local level. And for those espousing sort of racial integrity, women's bodies performed a really important function, right? They could both be the transgressors, right, as sort of biological reproducers. If they transgress the racial lines, right, then they could upset this quest for racial integrity. But race scientists at the time period, particularly those emerging out of Cold Springs Harbor in New York, believed that women had this particular biological ability to recognize race mixing. Okay, it was not at all scientific, but that's what they articulated. And so it was important for them to train women as social workers to go out and do this work, right? And I think here, Haley Harrell's work as a pre-doctoral fellow on sort of mixing might also be helpful. So registrars prevented interracial marriage by denying marriage licenses based on what they determined was the racial identity, and they used surnames and rumors. School teachers reported in counties in Virginia children that they suspected of being mixed race. Midwives were threatened with jail time if they did not fill out this form appropriately. Children were kicked out of white segregated schools. And even into the 1980s, there's reports of hospital administrators deciding the race of children or babies born to people based on their last names and without their parents' permission. And so here we have, you can see the back of this registration card that was a result of the 1924 legislation. Added to this, right, in the way that sort of white supremacist politics worked, was sociology professors at the nearby Sweetbriar Women's College asked their students to go do a service learning project. This always makes me suspicious of service learning projects. Well, not suspicious, but I always am like, okay, what's actually happening? So these young women were asked to go out into these communities in Amherst and Rockbridge County, Virginia, which had a long historic population of folks who were thought to be a mix of white, Black, and Native American. And so these students were, for their projects, were sent to go out and interview and record their observations and make judgments about the racial ancestry and behavior of these folks that lived on Bear Mountain and Irish Creek in Amherst and Rockbridge counties. This is the same area, if you're familiar with Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, that Jake and Sing come from. Like her characters in that novel, Jake and Sing, are from this part of Virginia. These young women, who were called the investigators in their sociology professors' scrapbooks, armed with the authority that higher education bestows, imbued with progressive era ideas of municipal housekeeping and an admiration for experts, gathered evidence and saw it published under a book entitled Mongrel Virginians. This is a book that used the work of students, while it did not attribute the work to them, to harden the color line, to allegedly demonstrate the dangers of race mixing. And this meant that generations of families would be denied access to public service, and that it would shape the still ongoing struggle in these counties of Western Virginia for the Monacan people to gain recognition as a Native American nation. So these efforts, right, to sort out, to deny marriage, to harden the racial lines in schools, to make midwives workers for the state, was first true in Virginia, but soon across the nation as anti-miscegenation laws proliferated and as juvenile incarceration and sterilization campaigns escalated. their stories, right? School teachers and registrars and social work students had helped draw race and shape policy. And the law could not have been enacted without them, right? That it is these women that had translated legislation into local practice and had instituted racial segregation community by community. Customary segregation, with the cooperation of local women in the state, morphed into legal, long-lasting local segregation. Electoral politics offered a different lesson in the interwar period. Across the South, white segregationist women positioned themselves as sort of truth tellers about racial segregation and positioned themselves as sort of the ideological purity police of the Democratic Party. In Mississippi, Mary Dawson Kane, and this is a picture from a little later, led a campaign to distinguish Mississippi's white Democrats who were committed to segregation from Roosevelt Democrats. And she came up with the name Jeffersonian, or she used the name Jeffersonian Democrats to say that they were the true Democratic Party, not the party of Roosevelt. This is a name that the Dixiecrats would eventually use in 1948. In South Carolina, this woman, Cornelia Dabney Tucker, helped take over the Republican Party, which had been a black and tan party from Reconstruction forward and made it lily white in the late 1930s. She wanted the Republican Party to be able to come in and conduct and gin up partisan support in South Carolina, particularly after 2 decades into the Great Migration. The Democratic Party at the national level had begun to assess their policies on racial segregation given the rising number of Black votes in northern and western cities. She also worked, in addition to bleaching the state's Republican Party, to get a secret ballot approved for South Carolina. That would be the last state in the nation to have one. And the Republican Party at the national level welcomed her efforts because they saw inroads into a Democratic-controlled region. So long before the Solid South ended, white segregationist women had begun cultivating and conducting campaigns to dislodge white voters from a Democratic Party that they thought did not adhere close enough to racial segregation. In the same decades, white women across the nation used the modern bureaucratic state to whitewash the nation's history. Southern states moved quickly towards state textbook selection committees. And I love this part, but I think this is maybe wonky and other people, this is when they begin to tune out. But what happened was the South adopted statewide textbook selection committees. And white segregationist women believed if they targeted these committees and made sure that they only selected certain textbooks, that they could rewrite the nation's history in the aftermath of the Civil War, of the populist campaigns, and of the disenfranchisement and establishment of Jim Crow. And so they targeted these committees and told them that they needed to read the textbooks and make sure that they did not have references to Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK, that they eliminated the stories of Forrest's Fort Pillow massacre, where Confederate soldiers under his command gunned down Black Union soldiers who were surrendering, that they needed to make sure that events like the Colfax massacre in Louisiana did not get in the textbooks, that slavery should be called a school, that the Civil War should be called the war between the states, and that Confederate leaders should be repackaged as national patriots. Because of the calculus of profit, national textbook companies followed the South's dictates. In 1938, the Mississippi Educational Association would conduct a survey and found that 20 years after this campaign started, that if a student read every single textbook in all the subjects from 1st through 12th grade, they would never meet one single Black American by name. Given the continued influence of Southern states in national publishing houses, this was as true in California as it was in Mississippi. The textbook narrative of American history for much of the 20th century would erase Black Americans, Black resistance, interracial organizing, and the violence required to maintain both the system of slavery and to build the system of racial segregation. And in one more sort of interwar example, that's about sort of cultural storytelling. In North Carolina, a progressive journalist, Nell Battle Lewis, she was educated at Smith College. She supported unionizing in North Carolina. She supported communist organizers. She made fun of the KKK in her articles. She made fun of the Daughters of American Revolution, of evangelicals. She defended Langston Hughes' visit to UNC Chapel Hill in the early 1930s. But when she started covering the textile strikes in 1929, and she covered them on a national level, her articles ran in The Nation, for example, she erased the interracial organizing of white and Black union members. In her defense of strikers and her effort to support them, she catered to the dictates of white supremacy. She offered up a whitened image of workers and organizers. In her storytelling, she erased the Black union organizers who came to Gastonia and Marion. She didn't talk about the interracial politics of the communist-held meetings. And instead, she talked about white organizers, and in her other columns talked about, quote, happy, contented Black sharecroppers and sacrificing mammies. She contributed a very different historical knowledge held by white Americans and Black Americans, this dual effort to highlight a contented working class of Black laborers and mammies and to erase Black activism and resistance and organizing along lines of class in the textile mills was part of Nell Battle Lewis's efforts at sort of this Jim Crow education and upholding this larger commitment to white supremacist politics. So by World War II, right, we have decades of work by white women as voters and citizens, as sort of political players in creating and sustaining racial segregation and white supremacist politics. And they had supported and created kind of this broad base of folks who they had tried to train in what it took to uphold racial segregation. And it had created an intellectual framework where segregation would seem natural, right? There's segregation in history, there's segregation in our schools, there's segregation in marriage, right? That they had worked at all these levels of society to sort of promote the fiction that racial segregation was kind of a natural state of things. And so I hope that that gives an example of sort of like the four ways and places that women, white segregationist women are working. And then we're going to look at how that comes together in the latter part of the 20th century in the decades after World War II and get through anti-busing. From the 1940s to the 1970s, we're going to look at I'm going to look at campaigns against the UN, the response to the Brown decision, which ended, supposedly ended or said that segregated schools were unconstitutional, and a nationwide commitment to anti-busing that cast aside an overt language of white supremacy and racial segregation in favor of one that articulated a colorblind discourse that elevated property rights, parental rights, and school choice. So the United Nations emerged in 1948 as a threat to both segregation and to national sovereignty when it advocated for human rights. I was sort of stunned at the opposition to like support for human rights. From the rubble of World War II and the advent of the atomic age and the Holocaust to state-sanctioned genocide, the UN Charter had defined human rights as, quote, rights due to all people regardless of race, sex, language, or religion. Segregation storytellers, right, largely women, claimed that this was dangerous in numerous ways, that this commitment to human rights, and these are the sort of larger 4 points of their argument. First, that the NAACP and the National Negro Congress had petitioned the UN to condemn the United States for its human rights abuses of lynching, rape, and other violence and abuse that came from the Jim Crow South. And so white women, segregationist women, saw the UN as sort of an ally of these civil rights organizations. Second, when the former First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, became the US ambassador to the UN and supported both the human rights and the genocide conventions, she added fuel to the segregationist fire. Eleanor Roosevelt had a reputation for crossing the color line, to dine with Black men and Black women, to attend Black graduations of nursing school, for example, in Harlem, to support Carter Woodson's Negro History Week, to challenge Americans to honor equality for all. White segregationist women said that what Eleanor Roosevelt was doing, some said, would permit the rape of white women by Black men and then prevent their punishment because it would be a human rights violation. And the DAR and the UDC joined this critique. But the real alarm that white segregationist women articulated was the last line of this often circulated story. And this is repeated over and over across the nation by people that are opposed to the United Nations. And it went like this, quote, "A Negro, a Chinese, or a member of a racial minority could insult you or your daughter. Your husband might shoot him, knock him down, or cuss him out. If so, he could be tried in an international court." And then this line, "It would also make it a crime to prevent racial intermarriage." So we're way back to 1924. "And intermarriage would destroy the white race, which has brought Christianity to the world." And so we see sort of the focus and the rise of white supremacist politics married to some particular strands of evangelicalism later. The third sort of problem with the UN, according to these female segregationists, was the UN's branch, UNESCO's attempt to offer a multicultural education curriculum, as part of the United Nations educational outreach. And so white segregationist women who had been really intent on controlling the textbook narratives and controlling the curriculum in the nation's public schools, were threatened by UNESCO's multicultural curriculum. Mississippi segregationist Florence Sillers Ogden reminded her readers that she wrote a weekly column in the Clarion Ledger, that the international intrusion into public schooling would uproot white women's ability to shape textbooks and school curriculum, and it would replace what she acknowledged was a whitewashed history with one world multiculturalism. Knowing that men would not take up this cause, Ogden reminded white women, quote, "It is you who must rise up and lead the way." And they did. In Texas, white women who belonged to the Minute Women defeated school board members who had adopted the UNESCO curriculum. In Los Angeles, segregationist women that were part of this organization called Pro America forced the resignation of a nationally renowned school superintendent, Willard Goslin. What had he done? He had dared to show a short human film called The Brotherhood of Man. He had encouraged his schools in his district to adopt and examine the UN's multicultural curriculum. He had conducted summer programs that these white mothers said eroded maternal authority. And he had also tried to end busing, but white middle-class parents wanted their children bused to white majority schools. And their campaign against him, where they accused him of eroding the influence of white founding fathers, of diminishing white national sovereignty and American exceptionalism, worked, and Willard Goslin resigned. This is in the early 1950s. They also told these white segregationist women across the nation that trick-or-treating for UNICEF was a communist plot, and instead of giving money to put in the orange boxes, that they should hand out anti-communist literature. In 1954, this anti-UN campaign manifested itself in campaigns for the Bricker Amendment. The Bricker Amendment would move treaty approval out of the US Senate into the state legislatures. And this campaign was one of Phyllis Schlafly's early campaigns. So in 1954, she leads the Vigilant Women for Bricker to campaign across the United States for opposition to the United Nations, which is expressed in a constitutional amendment. Supporters of the Bricker Amendment argued that the UN would infect our free America with world government and socialism. And they were joined by organizations like the Minutewomen, the DAR, the UDC, Christian Parents for a Better Education, and Pro-America to support the Bricker Amendment, which met defeat in the US Senate by 1 vote in 1954. Meanwhile, as part of this campaign, Southern newspapers covered decolonization efforts in Africa with the most lurid details that emphasize the unfitness of Africans in Africa to rule, and became portable to a discourse of African Americans' unreadiness to be full-fledged citizens in the United States. Racial segregation by 1954 had gone national and had coalition members that stretched from Pasadena to Boston. The final thing I'll say about the UN before I go on is it also, in attributing fault to Eleanor Roosevelt, allowed white segregationist women to hide Black activism and erase it and lodge it in a white woman, right? So the racial upheavals and the civil rights campaigns for voting rights, for an end to sexual violence, to change sexual assault laws, to end police brutality, those campaigns that gained steam in World War II and were part of the national political landscape by the 1950s, white segregationist women erased all those and said that it was Eleanor Roosevelt's sort of travels across the color line that had done this. So one part of this education in Jim Crow citizenship was to erase any kind of homegrown Black leadership. And I think we can see echoes of that today. So the erasure of Black activism continued, right, in this anti-UN campaigns until the Brown decision in 1954, when it was impossible to ignore widespread Black activism, right? As African-American parents got their children ready to integrate schools, right? As students conducted sit-ins and desegregated interstate busing, right? It was impossible to argue and continue to argue, right, that there's not this sort of Black activism. So faced with widespread Black organizing in the aftermath of the Brown decision, white women took to the streets. But they also did other things, and I think that are more familiar, or maybe less familiar, but more widespread. Public school teachers joined groups like the Paul Revere Ladies in Mississippi to sponsor speakers and essay contests. They recruited students to join organizations like Patriotic American Youth. They encouraged their networks to oppose multicultural education. Local PTA chapters voted against compulsory attendance in the aftermath of Brown. They voted to reject the national PTA's endorsement of school integration on the basis of states' rights, not white supremacy. And we see these early articulations or escalating articulations of colorblind language. Some counties ended public education entirely. Others experimented with vouchers or state money for schools that would make their publics exclusive, not inclusive. Women's groups stocked libraries with particular histories that emphasized Black malfeasance during Reconstruction, the satisfaction of enslaved peoples, and the radicalism and un-Americanism of civil rights activists. Some even pushed for equal funding of segregated schools in the aftermath of the Brown decision to avoid, they hoped, what were its repercussions. And a Smithsonian docent made sure that Black children touring the museum learned, as she put it, quote, all that the white man had done to civilize America. In Mississippi in 1960, the Citizens Council led Citizens Council funded effort led by teacher Sarah McCorkle conducted an essay contest 6 years after the Brown decision on why I believe in the social separation of the races of mankind. 5,000 essays were submitted in 1960. Rewards were given to the best one by a woman and the best won by a man. The prize was $500, which in 1960 would have paid for 4 years of tuition at the University of Mississippi. Again and again, right, white women facing the aftermath of the Brown decision had conducted this widespread campaign, from sort of very interpersonal relationships to building white segregation, white supremacy into the systems, right, in the midst of the civil rights movement. And then in the 1960s, some segregationist women began to shift away from an overtly racist political language, and more often traffic in a colorblind discourse. And this was embraced equally in Mississippi, in Boston, in Louisville, in Milwaukee. And these colorblind discourses reframed opposition to civil rights and racial integration along that by invoking family values, by invoking states' rights, and by invoking sort of property rights. In 1962, women from states across the South and Illinois organized the Women for Constitutional Government. They're not a large organization, but they professed a commitment to constitutional and conservative government, anti-communism, and parental choice. They distributed reading lists that would be free from liberal internationalizing propaganda. They celebrated mothers of school children, believers of prayer, and followers of the Christian faith. And they reminded their members that the racial component was just one symptom of a larger disease of a behemoth federal government that reached into everyday life. Opposition to school integration and civil rights, they said, was not about white supremacy. It was about parental choice, the right to school choice, and even opposition to sex education. In fact, after working with women in this organization from Chicago and Houston and California, Southern segregationist Florence Sellers Ogden was confident that her views were national views that could be translated into a more successful colorblind political language. And in 1964, she predicted that when school integration came north and west, that white women there would act much like their Southern sisters. 10 years later, her story was true. And this picture is from Boston. And that's Louise Day Hicks, who would lead this campaign. The actors in Boston that took to the streets were not, for the most part, members of the KKK. Okay, they were members of the home and school associations. They emphasized that they were not like Southern segregationists. They didn't make people sit in the back of the bus. They didn't demand completely segregated schools. Instead, these women talked about criminal and violent Black children. They invoked the language of academic difference. They said busing eroded their powers as mothers and talked about it as unconstitutional. They minimized their white supremacy, even as they stood outside playgrounds yelling racist epithets to school children, even as they chained themselves to a busing lot in Pontiac, Michigan, vandalized the cars of Black and white women activists who were assisting with busing, and then some put on their aprons, invoked their motherhood, and marched to Washington to protect their children. Black Bostonians kept reminding the public that it's not the bus, it's us. But their cries largely went unheard then and now. Right? Rather than calling these women segregationist, historians and public intellectuals alike, let me see if I can go to the next one, right, have called them anti-bussers. They were not for white supremacy, they were for school choice. They were not motivated by racism, they were motivated by class concerns. They had never pushed anyone to the back of the bus, their politics were about family values. Thus, the retooling of the political rhetoric that white segregationist women had tried out in their campaigns against the UN had gone national by the 1970s. Homeowner interests, parental rights, and family values became the new words of racial campaigns to recreate segregation for a new era. And this campaign reinforced certain constructions of white motherhood. For example, white women in Boston or Charlotte did not defend Linda Brown's choice in Topeka, Kansas in 1954 to attend her neighborhood school. Her choice did not matter. They had not joined Black women when they chose to protect their bodies by petitioning governors to rewrite sexual assault laws in Alabama and ensure that white men who raped Black women were punished. The choices of Black parents to seek schools where resources were better or where their children did not have to ride a bus past 3 other schools were not under the umbrella of school or parental choice. In West Virginia, the choice of Black coal mining families in the 1970s to have a curriculum that taught the economic and cultural messages of Black power or lessons in wrongful imprisonment were met instead, right, were met with defeat by a school board that instead agreed that the accommodationist writings of Booker T. Washington could be included in the school curriculum. Choice, it seemed, amid anti-busing, amid school integration, and its link to family values and property were the purview of white mothers in the public discourse, not Black ones. Stopping integrated education in order to prevent interracial marriage was a choice reserved, again, for white parents, not Black ones. Steeped in history, steeped in national iterations of racial segregation, motherhood and womanhood were infused in these campaigns by white segregationists with racial identities. So what do we do with these stories, right, that are now like 50 years old? I think there's a couple things that we can think about, right, in ways that might be useful for today. We can realize that the persistence of white supremacist politics and white women's roles in crafting and sustaining and reproducing its policies and power was and is not new. And it does not simply reside in laws and violence. It has required workers from all walks of life, educated and uneducated, career women and homemakers, Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, moderates, and those on the far right. While we cannot and should not ignore violence, it is also important that we look beyond it to local communities, to local people and structures where everyday women are working in public welfare, education, electoral politics, and culture to reinforce white supremacy. If we see only violence, we will be ill-equipped to counter the institutional systems that reproduce racial inequities. The story of white women's political mobilization during the 20th century is also the story of white women's mobilization for white supremacist politics. Very often, the definition that academics use for politics renders much, and the public, renders much of the grassroots organizing and policy building done on the ground by women invisible or less relevant. And this is as true of white women on the right as it is on Black women organizing for voting rights or for an end to police brutality. But on the right, there have been generations of white women, numerous and well-organized, who have supported racial segregation specifically and white supremacist politics generally. The fourth sort of thing to think about is that motherhood was and remains a critical political construct. In the hands of segregationist women, motherhood could inspire guarding certain rights and protection, as much as it could, in the hands of others, justify an expansive social welfare state that served all children. For segregationists, motherhood has functioned as a political strategy, as a form of political protection, and a call for action. Motherhood was racialized, and being a good white mother meant performing and teaching certain actions about whiteness and Blackness to your children and to your community's children. So we are living with the results of this work, of this multifaceted, sort of large public education campaign in Jim Crow citizenship. This makes the dismantling particularly hard. And for those who are committed to producing it, I'm not sure how to go about changing sort of their mind. But we also can look and understand, right, that there are large numbers of people who consumed this, right? And perhaps they are ripe for change. To sustain various iterations of segregation took lots of work in lots of places at all levels of society. And whether we can change it or not, these stories remind us that the fight is where we are, it is where we live, and it is in the communities that we care about. Thank you very much, and I now hope I'll answer questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much for such a timely and provocative talk. It's a shame that those questions are still timely and relevant today, and that this isn't just a historical analysis. I'm going to remind everybody that if you have questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A. I'm going to start with a question from my colleague, Hank Klibanoff. Other than Jim Loewen and Charles Sallis in Mississippi, have historians in other states rewritten state history textbooks to correct the distortions of the past? Their book was Mississippi Conflict and Change, mid-1970s. Did Southern state textbook commissions resist these corrected versions?
That's a really good question. And I guess since I ended my work in the 1970s, I can't answer that sort of definitively. But I think we've seen the evidence of resistance of rewriting the textbooks. If we look at some of the debates about how the system of slavery was being talked about in Texas, if we look at the 1776 report, which had, did not carry much policy weight since it was right after President Trump's defeat, but I think echoes much of what folks who have resisted, right, a history that acknowledges and includes the very people and events that the women I wrote about tried to write out. I think we still have, and the resistance to the 1619 Project. I think we see, so have there been attempts to rewrite? I think yes, but I couldn't answer that in the specificity that you did about Mississippi, but is there still resistance? Certainly.
Let me just ask a follow-up question to that. It relates to the 1776 Project. The commission itself was light on academics in general, but where it did have academics, they were political scientists, they weren't historians, and I'm embarrassed for my own discipline to say that. But like, what does it mean when you are putting political scientists as opposed to historians on a committee to talk about rewriting history curriculum in the United States?
I think it means you had to, not to pick on political scientists as a discipline, I think it probably was hard to find academics that were willing to sign on to that, right, project, just because it counters not just the historical work of the last 75 years, right, but it also counters a lot of good political scientist work, right, and a lot of good cultural theory. I think the sort of interdisciplinary nature of that report of who gets included and who doesn't, right, was problematic for a host of disciplines, yeah. And I think historians, I think the humanities in general has been picked on for their sort of participation in widening the curriculum and debating what should be included and not, in ways that maybe disciplines outside of the humanities have been spared that a little more. But again, I'm probably on shaky ground there.
Great. Well, this question is from Francine Allen. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. Could you talk about the general response, support, or reaction to the work of white segregationist women by the men in their lives, family members, neighbors, employees, and about whether these women ever addressed their marginalized status as women?
Yeah, so I think that's probably one of the weaknesses of my work is the women that sort of carry the narrative thread in the book would not have considered themselves marginalized, right? Even though, right, they would have acknowledged that they're working in a patriarchal system. In a weird way, they condemned the men in their lives, right? Not just their personal lives, because some of them, but the sort of larger structure where men were involved in politics for kind of, and got benefits, right? Got professional and career benefits in ways that women didn't. And so white men couldn't be counted on, right, to do the right thing in terms of racial segregation, because they had to be aware of democratic, getting the right appointments, right, to democratic committees, or they were too embedded in this partisan political system. So in a strange way, there's kind of a deep criticism among these white segregationist women that I write about, right, that are these producers of men who failed, right? Who failed to uphold the color line in sort of profound ways. Now, I do think, like one of the women I wrote about, right, would call for women to be on juries, for white women to be on juries, would say that the Democratic Party needed to put women in committee assignment. She would run for governor, right, in Mississippi in 1951. 1952. Anyway, in the early 1950s, she would run twice for governor. And so she would talk about, I think, right, sexual inequality, but not in a way that sort of called out her man, right? She didn't call out her husband. She talked about sort of white men's failures on a more global scale. I think the anti-bussers in Boston are an interesting, because they saw anti-busing as a feminist issue. And when feminists did not sign on to protect the rights of mothers, then they, right, became sort of anti-feminist, that they said women had left homemaking women behind, right? That white feminists had left homemaking white women, working class women behind, and that their feminism didn't speak to sort of their sort of lives.
Thank you. The next question is from Haley Harrell. This was a fascinating discussion. Thank you. My question is about the role of mixed race bodies in relation to an erasure of Black history, voices, and activism. Was the interracial child a regularly invoked or invoked at all to incite fear about integration, similar to the nature of the rape of white women by Black men? Or was the interracial child completely erased, erasing alongside it a longstanding history of forced racial intermixture during slavery? And I'll just add to that, if people are kind of looking and eyeballing people based on what their perceived racial mixed race identity was there even an acknowledgement that, you know, in some families you might see certain genetic features that we commonly associate with certain types of phenotypes, but everybody in the family is perhaps identifying as being Black?
Yeah, so I think, let me see if I can get all the parts of that question. So in the 20s, particularly if you look at Virginia and in Louisiana, like there were a similar white woman that was in charge of the Bureau of Vital Statistics. So interracial children and interracial people were a significant challenge to drawing the color line. Right? Like it was, and the fear of passing was particularly pronounced among these race scientists and just like this Anglo-Saxons clubs of America, right? That were really clear that whiteness had to be sort of preserved, right? In ways that it had not. And there's some acknowledgement that in the past, right, and they would only talk about it in the past, that white wayward men had endangered the race, right? But they would not have talked about it in terms of rape or sexual violence, right? I think there was always this underlying notion of sort of consensual, right, of what they imagined was consensual sex. But I think interracial people were, or people who had an interracial heritage were threats to the Jim Crow order in the 1920s as that line is trying to harden. And in Virginia, like African-American communities, like in Newport News and different places, didn't really weigh in on the Racial Integrity Act, right? Because it was so aimed at people with this liminal racial identity, right, that people could sort out. And so, but in the sort of larger project, white women's, I want to say 99% of the writings I read of white women were concerned about marriage, were not concerned about what I think we see coming out of the 1890s, right, and lynching about the rape of white women by Black men. After the Brown decision, all the letters were about what schools would let people love other people and marry them, right? Like that was the fear, was marriage and the children that would come out of that marriage, right? And so I think that I was, and maybe if I looked further, I would find different evidence, but I was pretty stunned by that over the course of time from the 20s up through the 70s, that when white women talked about their fears of integrated education, it was all about marriage. It was almost never about violence, about sexual violence, right, or rape.
Hmm. When the Virginia laws were kind of coming into play, and you say Newport News was silent, what about Caroline County, where Loving versus Virginia actually hails from, but where there's just a ton of admixture? And so, were there objections there based on that, based on what your research found?
I didn't look at Caroline County where the Lovings were. And I think in part in Virginia, the state registrar was from Amherst County or Rockbridge County. And so his focus was so on that community of folks who had claimed Black, white, and Indian heritage. And in many ways, that law wiped out Native American identity in Virginia. In fact, so much that, right, all these first families, these fancy families in Virginia had said they were related to Pocahontas. So there was a Pocahontas exception in the law, right? So if you could trace your lineage back to Pocahontas, right, then you could remain white. But if you had any other sort of Native American ancestors, then you moved into the Black category of the census.
And then there's even just implications for tribal recognition. Like they were still fighting that, like even up until the last decade. If you look at certain indigenous groups in Virginia, like the Mattaponi or the Pamunkey. I mean, you mentioned Monacans, and I had forgotten. But like these groups were not recognized by the federal government in part because of, what happened back in the 1920s.
And because that they've recognized an African heritage in their in their population, because they have acknowledged, right, that there was Black, white, and Indian members, right, from the 1700s forward. Yeah, and I don't think the Monacans I don't think they have federal recognition.
So. Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, the one I would be most familiar with, just in terms of people I know and are related to, would be the Rappahannocks, and I don't think that they have federal tribal recognition yet either, but I'll have to check on that.
Right, and those that are from, a couple of you are from North Carolina, right? The Lumbees, wrestle with this too, right? And the same sort of accusations of this idea of racial purity and racial intermixture that have complicated tribal recognition.
So the next question is from Barbara Combs. Thank you so much for your talk in this important book. I really appreciate how you illuminate the ways white women have been at the center of cultivating white supremacist policies in not only the South, but the nation. When I think about the efforts to infuse textbooks with lost cause ideology, I can't help but think about the 1776 Commission report. Can you talk a little about those links? How do you think white women will respond?
Well, I think, let me see if I can answer that question. So I think it's, and Professor Combs sort of points at this. I think if we look at the headlines about not only white women in public education, but if we, January 6th, if we look at the Stacey Abrams campaign in Georgia, the Roy Moore campaign, that the headlines are always, there is this element of surprise that white women could have voted this way, right? Or that white women would support a curriculum that does these things. And I think the evidence is really overwhelming that this is not a surprise. It's been a generational story, right, of white women, both on the right and the left and in the middle, wielding power in sort of public education. But I think, and that they've been players, right? And I think the 1776 report didn't have, if I looked at the authors, I don't remember looking particularly for women, but my sense was it was mostly men that were authors in the 1776 report. But the language of the 1776 report could almost be lifted from Mildred Lewis Rutherford's periodicals in the 20s about what Southern textbooks should say, right? Like who should be written in and who should be written out, and calling enslaved people servants rather than slaves. I mean, I think the way that the 1776 report elevated a few Black Americans, but then sort of eliminated so much of what is a really widely acknowledged history, fits right into the playbook from the 1920s forward. And I think Florence Sellers Ogden was sort of right. You know, in the 1960s, everyone's talking about voting rights and the desegregation of schools. And she's like, hey, we can still keep doing essay contests and controlling textbook content and curriculum because they aren't ever going to get to that, right? Like we still have that power. And I think, you know, we're not that many generations out from that.
Yeah. So a quick internet search. I think there were, from what I could see, there were 2 women who were on the commission, 1 white, 1 Black. Yeah. The next question is from Edgar Randolph. The creation of the motherland by local women activists is in direct conflict with the fatherland of international human rights and the United Nations. The civil rights movement was both international and local, father and motherland. How did white women and Black women, white men and Black men interact at the local space as well as the national and international space?
Around the issues of the United Nations, is that like, is the question?
Or around questions of race, yeah, broadly.
Let's see if I can answer that. So one of the things that I found, right, and there's some work that Brenda Plummer's work is particularly helpful, I think, in this. There's an older dissertation by a woman named Ann Zeiker that looks at how deeply embedded white segregationist women were in this larger international white supremacist effort. So in the United States, for example, there's a group called Friends of Rhodesia that a lot of the women I write about are also members of, right? A far right group, right, that's focused on sort of supporting white colonial efforts in Rhodesia. And so that Friends of Rhodesia is part of this early far right that has all this cross membership, right? Like the woman in Pasadena that was pro-America is communicating with folks that are FOR, Friends of Rhodesia, right? Florence Sellers Ogden and Mary Dawson Kane, who are in Mississippi, are also communicating. And so I think there's this cross-pollination between white women and white men, segregationists and white supremacists in the United States, with anti-decolonization advocates across the globe, right? And they are in conversation. South Africa is particularly salient for segregationists, and that those efforts would be covered. I mean, I think if you pick up the Raleigh News and Observer, the Jackson Clarion Ledger today, you don't see much coverage of African nations. If you picked it up in the 1960s, there's extensive coverage, right? It's problematic coverage for sure, but I think it is very much, I think the UN introduced very much an international forum for white supremacists across the globe to sort of begin in conversation. So that doesn't fully answer your question, but that's probably the best I can do.
Wow. So a question from an anonymous attendee. I know that in certain areas, African-American parents and students also resisted desegregation in schools in order to prevent children from being further exposed to racist classmates and teachers in white schools. Did segregationist white women align themselves with that narrative at all?
Yeah, so after the Brown decision, there's this meeting, I can't remember the name, in Memphis, Tennessee, and the white segregationist women that attended were really proud to talk about the few Black women and men that attended opposing school integration, right? But and so they knew there were some folks out there. I think the reasons that, so David Soselski has a book about this in North Carolina, the reasons that certainly Black communities were wary and even opposed to integration was the fear of what happened, right? The loss of like Black history, in the schools, the loss of teachers and principals, right? So as children were integrated, significant number of Black teachers and Black principals and administrators lost their jobs. And so, and the idea that your children are going to be are going to be exposed to what they knew were the ravages of kind of a daily campaign of white supremacy in these integrated schools, I think were some of the reasons that African Americans were wary or opposed racial integration. Those are very different reasons than why segregationist women, but they were happy to take allies wherever they could get them, right? And so they did acknowledge that, of course, in the way they would put it, that real Black people, right, the same who had been satisfied with segregation were opposed to racial integration, right? So they would have whitewashed the sort of more complicated politics to sort of bring them on as allies.
So this question is from Henry Kahn. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. I recall that as a presidential candidate in 2019, Kamala Harris pointed to the anti-busing history of her opponent, Joe Biden. Is this an opportunity for President Biden to comment on the history to which he contributed? He has credibility among women. His historical view could be very helpful to our historical recollections.
Yeah, I keep wondering when that's going to sort of circle back, because I think what now Vice President Harris pointed out is a larger uncomfortable truth about the United States, is that far more people across the nation opposed busing than did, right? If there was widespread agreement outside of the white South that the Brown decision was the right decision and schools should be integrated, there was far more agreement nationally among white Americans that busing was not the answer. And so I think Biden's, that exchange exposes, and I think Professor Combs has talked about this, a real national investment, right, in racial inequity and racist inequity, right, and that, and how that's imbued with ideas of neighborhood and property values. And so when it's in someone else's neighborhood, you can talk about that being the right thing to do. But when it comes to your neighborhood, and this is true in Boston and Milwaukee and Louisville, right, that there is a lot more people that were, because of the colorblind discourse, that were willing to sign on to anti-busing that would have been unwilling to sign on to be anti-Brown, for example.
Thank you. So this question is from Sean Jones, who's president of our local Asala branch. Thank you for this important work. Given the fact that white women in the North and West are in denial about the white supremacist worldviews and actions in the era you study, how do Black people speak to this in 2021, when not only the overt racism and voter suppression efforts of a Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia are cheered and encouraged to enact racist policies, but Kellyanne Conway, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, Nikki Haley, Liz Cheney, Kristi Noem, Joni Ernst, et cetera, are championing the covert racism around voting rights, education, poverty, and white supremacist ideology advocated for by the Donald Trumps, Mitch McConnell's, Ted Cruz's, Stephen Miller's, Kevin McCarthy's, and Ron Johnson's of the world?
Well, I think in part one, I might say go read Charles Blow's new book, right, which I think talks about sort of the ravages of white supremacist politics, of residential segregation, of in the North, right, and actually calls for an expanded remigration to the South, where he sees the potential for political power. But I think this is the real dilemma, right? The crux of this colorblind political language, that around issues of neighborhood schools, for example, around issues that talk about culture rather than race, right? folks talking in a different political discourse have been allowed and permitted and promoted, right, to enact policies that would be very recognizable, right, in the Jim Crow South as sort of white supremacist policies, but because the language has changed. And so I think, I think Black Lives Matter as activists have tried to sort of push the awareness, right, of the kind of ravages of white supremacy in northern and western places, right, on a national scale, not just on a southern scale. But I think people like Marjorie Taylor Greene are helpful in returning, well, helpful, I don't know, play an important part in returning and highlighting that sort of white supremacy and racism is done particularly well in the American South, right? And I'm not saying that it wasn't done well in the American South, but I think sometimes that narrative allows a larger national innocence to perpetuate other places, right, and lead to a lack of reckoning with what is a national, right, problem that has manifested itself differently in different times in different places.
Thank you. John Willingham asks, if we want to claim a more enlightened and inclusive future, where should we be investing our time, political capital, and money today? What is making the most profound impact today?
I know, Professor Gillespie, maybe you could answer that question as a political scientist better. I spend most of my time not in this century in my intellectual time, but I do think if I learned one of the things I learned from doing this research is I think you should look to the ground and see who's doing the work, right? And invest in the people already doing the work. That this work, voting rights, curriculum work, anti-police brutality work against or work for carceral rights, right? The rights of folks incarcerated. I think it's being done. I think if we look at where you are, right, that for a long time, the work that was being done on the ground by voting registration efforts was sort of missed, I think in part because of the people that were doing it. And so I think we have to widen our view, right, and look to the people on the ground. And I would say this, like when you look at historically, if you look at a church, right, there's generally in the South that there's a man in the pulpit. But if you look at the work being done, it's the church ladies in the back. And so I would say politically, use that metaphor to look for the church ladies. Like there are folks doing this work. And I think there's so much work to be done and so much work being done that there's lots of places we can put our money and capital depending on our gifts.
Edgar Randolph asks, in the South, people often say I marched with King. The question is, did you support busing and the integration of the school system? How do we question what was done then and what is happening now? Who is doing the work?
Yeah, well, I think part of it is we have to decide which King we're talking about, right? And I think often Dr. King is frozen in time in an earlier kind of iteration. And so which King is it that you marched with, right? Is it the King that was in Memphis? Is it the King that spoke out against Vietnam? Is it the King that had come to a more radical sort of worldview of politics and of economics? And I think the King in 1967 and 1968 is different than the King in 1955. And so I think that's one way to think about it. But I think King was made possible by the work that people did by the Ella Bakers of the world, by the Fannie Lou Hamers of the world, by the John Lewises of the world, by the by folks on the ground doing that work. And I think not at all to diminish the work that Dr. King did, but I think when, again, we broaden our view to see who are the workers, that it lets us look at the politics of anti-busing. It lets us look at like I think Vanessa Saddle Walker's recent work, right, is just so helpful in thinking about like the complicated political debates that were behind, right, Black education and Black crusades for educational equity in the South. And so I think that there, sometimes our attention to King makes us miss the multiple political campaigns that were going on as part of the civil rights movement.
So are there any more questions? Okay. So seeing none, I know you can't see everybody who is on the call, but we just want to thank you for such a powerful talk. Thank you for honoring Emory faculty and our fellows by acknowledging their work. And for those of you who are here, we hope that you come back next week. Our speaker is going to be Dr. Craig Watkins from the University of Texas. So with that, please have a great afternoon, and we will see you next week. Take care.